Howdy y'all, Greg once again. More suspension stuff. Start house. We got a blown up rear shock, air in the damper, which is very bad. You don't want that. We're going to tear this thing down, replace all the primary dynamic seals. We're going to put new air seals in there. It's been a few years since this thing's been serviced, so it kind of needs it anyhow, but this thing is exhibiting problems, so I'm just going to nip that in the butt and make it all happen. So, here we go. Okay, sometimes taking the shocks off the bike is the hardest part of doing the shock. So we're going to record settings. So we're 5 clicks out on rebound, or sorry, compression. So we're 5 on compression. Seven on rebound. And we're probably 200 in the rear shock before we lost some pressure from connecting the pump. Okay. So in general, what you've got with the rear shock, before you let any air out or nitrogen pressure out, you're basically working on almost a bomb. We got a lot of pressure in the air chamber right here, and there's pressure inside this piggyback reservoir in the form of nitrogen. Sometimes these pressures are really high. This one's only 150, but sometimes these are 500 psi of nitrogen, so you want to be really careful in there. I'm going to let the air out of the main air chamber for the air spring. I'm going to remove the air sleeve, and that's one component of the shock. The next component is the damper. That's kind of the brains of the operation, and that's the part we're going to rebuild right now. Air sleeve, air sleeve. Okay, we're going to take off the main air seals, and these white things are glide rings. They kind of help keep stuff separated inside the shock so you don't scratch your air can. And then we've got damper unit. Again, this is kind of the brains of the operation. This keeps some control in the system, so as the shock compresses and rebounds, oil flows through valving in here and in here, and keeps the speeds controlled a little bit. And that's where the problem is somewhere in this unit. Okay, so as I said before, the nitrogen pressure, they hide down in the reservoir here. So we're going to get rid of that. And there's your nitrogen charge. Okay. And then we're going to carefully remove the resi end cap, so it is called. Boom. Okay. And we're going to push the air cap down, plug this circlip out of here. And then, if you can see down in there, your IFP, internal floating piston. And that floating piston moves up and down as the shock compresses and rebounds. And the nitrogen charge in there helps to push the IFP back down on a rebound stroke to keep everything happy. Okay, so we're going to get rid of the seal head here. And out with the old oil. Actually doesn't look too bad for a shock this old. Okay. And that's your IFP, internal floating piston. And that's more oil. Okay, so the main seal that we need to replace in these guys, the one that usually fails, is right here in the main seal head. 9 times out of 10, because this thing is moving every time the shock compresses or rebounds, the seal in here, of course, takes a lot of action. Gets pretty hot in there as well. The oil breaks down, the seals break down, and before you know it, you got a problem. I like to load all this stuff onto a pick or something just to keep all the valve shims in order so I don't have to look at the chart and rebuild the valve stack, although sometimes you need to anyhow. How deep you're going to go into a shock really is dictated by what's going on inside it. This shock not being that old, a couple years, having a little bit of air in the damper, I know that there's nothing super deep inside here, and I don't want to waste the customer's money and a bunch of time digging into seals and stuff that aren't bad in the first place. So I don't want to disrupt any of that stuff that's just working good the way it is. Top out O-ring, main seal head. This is where the action happens in here. We got a bottom out O-ring in there. Put a new one in there. There's a bottom out plate. We're gonna put a new air can seal in there while we're at it. And we're gonna hang this guy above our oil catch pan to let the rest of the oil drain out of there. I don't see any metal flakes or anything funny coming out of the oil, so again, I'm not worried about there being anything wrong deeper in the shock. Okay, all these seals are getting replaced. This seal head I'm going to clean up with a little bit of isopropyl alcohol and some compressed air. Okay. Okay. Now the IFP sees a lot of action as well between the pressures, the heat, and the movement. So we're going to replace that seal as well. That's a pretty common seal that can go bad, give you problems. That all looks good. No scratches in there. Just for good measure, we'll replace this one as well. Okay, new parts. Time for some new parts. Okay, get just a little bit of grease on this thing so it seats down in the seal gland nice and easy. And then the static seal, same kind of thing. And then we'll get our main unit back together here. So we got our air can seal. Pop that guy back in. I've inspected the shaft here. There's no scratches on this guy. I've inspected the inner bore of the IFP reservoir, and there's no scratches in there. So I know that that stuff is not going to be problematic down the road. And we're just going to start reversing the order of the way it came apart. So bottom out plate, bottom out bumper, seal head, top out bumper, and then our valve stack. Now this kit comes with a new piston and glide ring, and we very much want to replace this as a, again, pretty common wear item inside the shock, so we want to replace that. So keep all these parts in order. So we get rid of that and put that back in there. Put this back together. And we're going to put that assembly back on after we get. Got to put all the parts back in. Leftover parts after a shock rebuild's bad. Okay, now okay, so that's half the brains of the operation. Once again, a little bit of grease on the IFP seal, and we're going to load that back inside the IFP chamber to help us some needle nose pliers. And we're going to use the vacuum machine to bleed the shock. So I'm going to put the circlip in there so that thing doesn't come shooting out and explode oil all over the shop. Get this ready for later. We're going to take our body, shock body, inspect that for scratches exteriorly and on the inside, and we're looking really good. So we'll pop this back together. Okay, so with the vacuum machine, you got to get rid of this plug and such.
Nope, hasn't moved. He's putting it off because it's a front derailleur.
Who wants to work on those bikes?
It's not far from the truth.
Badly. And I was like, oh, I get it.
Nice.
It's pretty
Big
funny.
brown trench.
Okay, the machine that beeps a lot. It's coming to life. You can vacuum these by hand, or bleed these by hand, I guess. You can't vacuum them by hand. You can bleed them by hand, but it's really hard and it never does as good of a job. So we spent quite a bit of money to get this vacuum machine, and this Italian Wonder right here is really cool. It helps us a lot to get these things done on the first shot, almost every time.
Caught us off guard a few times.
Okay, so the first thing this thing does is it runs about a 1.5-minute cycle where it's just pulling a lot of vacuum out of the shock. That will ensure that there's no funny business in there, so when we go to charge it with oil, we're getting nice clean oil in there. There's nothing left inside the shock to get messed up. That was terrible. Lee, don't put that in the video. Okay, here we go. So, the filling process has begun. So right now the vacuum machine is providing constant oil pressure of the oil that's prescribed for this shock. And the goal here is to cycle things around and purge out any air that's stuck and trapped inside all these little caverns, because the oil flows from here through the shaft, through the eyelet, up into the IFP, and we got to get all the air bubbles out of this shock. So depends on the shock what we do here. Spinning this guy around is usually a pretty foolproof way to do it. I hear a couple bubbles in there. And of course the vacuum machine's hooked up right here, so this is the highest point in the shock. So all the air, in theory, should be escaping out of here, getting trapped in this high point in the hose, and resupplied with nothing but oil. So our machine is going to just atmospheric pressure right now, and once this thing balances out, we've got the IFP full of oil. Everything's full of oil. Of course, there needs to be some nitrogen space in here. IFP depth for this particular shock is 1.50 inches, plus or minus almost nothing. So I've got my gauge set here to just that. We'll sink this, put the cap back on, charge it with nitrogen, which is 150 psi in this particular shock, and then we'll get back to the business of getting back to business and put the air can together. So 150. Careful not to scratch the inside of that. disconnect our oil supply. And our vacuum machine attachment. I put an extra seal down here to aid in the sealing of the vacuum machine into the shock. We're going to put a plug in there and put the bleed screw back in, snug that up. Eventually we'll put a pellet in there so people can't inadvertently turn that and make a huge mess of themselves and the shock. We'll plug our IFP back out of there. I guess I could set it on fire and melt it out. Alright. It's time to make some tools here. And there you go. It's just that easy. God. Okay. Alright, so we make sure we got nothing in there in form of lint or other stuff. This is Fox float fluid. We're going to put about 2 drops of fluid in there just to keep things kind of happy. Happy environment for our IFP. I'll put this in here. Put our circlip back in there. We'll pick this back up to the top. Put on our resi cap. Before we do that, we'll wipe a little bit of oil out of there. Not that that would really cause any major harm, but cleanliness is godliness when it comes to suspension. So we'll take a new seal for the IFP and we will charge with nitrogen. So, okay, fun time. So there's a couple ways that nitrogen gets put into shocks. Fox uses for the most part a needle valve system, which that's your needle right there. Probably can't see that. This needle pokes through the pellet I just put back in there into the shock and pierces through into the open chamber, and that's how all that works. Okay. Okay, 150 psi is the prescribed nitrogen pressure for the shock. Lock it tight, pull that off. And we should have a charged rear shock. So let's find out. Test our lockout. That's pretty locked out. Test our rebound. That's keeping the rebound locked down. Okay, so where we go. Oh, that is surely going to ruin the f***ing seal. I did that with the goddamn... Sometimes I hate filming shit. It seems like every time we film shit, something gets... Hi. We're back. Folks, sometimes you're the windshield, sometimes you're the bug. Yesterday I was the bug. In my fight with gravity, I dropped this shock. It fell on the ground. Something happened on its way to Mother Earth. And we put a scratch on the body of the shock, which means the air seals will be compromised, so I can't send it out like that. It's gonna fail and then our reputation's crap. We don't like that. So, we got new parts. We're gonna take this rig out of the wrapper, we're gonna take the shock back apart, we're gonna put it back together, we're gonna attempt to not drop it on the ground, and finally get this guy's bike up and running. All right. We let the air out of the can again. We're gonna make sure again we're empty. Can off. We need to remove pellet valve plug. Well, bam. They say things are always easier the second time. Let me tell you, I've had some practice at second times. Shoop-a-doo. A little hook magic in there. Some needle nose. Okay, somewhat abbreviated situation from yesterday because we're not replacing all these parts because most of the seals I put in there are going to be just fine and dandy. We need to get main seal head out of the body. Arr. Oh, hi. Hold on there, folks. That piece is important. Let's save that piece. Okay. Pellet. More pellet parts. Okay. I'll make a wind chime out of that. New parts. This lucky customer is getting a free Kashima coated shock body. So, we're going to tighten this guy back up. We're going to get our nitro machine, or sorry, our vacuum machine hooked back up here. Re-vacuum the shock. Put fresh oil back in the shock, re-nitrogen the shock, not drop the shock on the ground, and then put the air can back on. Tank 1, R35 weight, okay. Extra seal in there to make the vac machine seal up nice and tight. See you after a bunch of noises. okay. Remember this part? In a second here, my machine is going to provide some positive oil pressure into the shock, constant for 2.5 minutes. In that 2.5 minutes, I'm going to cycle the shock to get all the air bubbles out of the system and into the ether. Okay, vacuum machine has done its magic. There's no more air left in the damper. All we have is oil in there. I'm gonna set the IFP, charge it with nitrogen, not drop the shock, put the air can back on. Again, 150 pounds of nitrogen. And if I scratch this one, we ordered 2, so it's all good. Boom. Okay, so we're tightening up our IFP port. Give that a little snug up so that doesn't get lost and misplaced on the trail. Clean up body. Can's still looking good. Just leave that in there. Take some float fluid. We're gonna put a little bit of float fluid, the main air seal, put our can on, and install approximately 2 to 3 cc's of float fluid inside the air chamber. New sag ring on there. Okay, and then once again, we're gonna cover up these ports with some, what they call Durlin balls, which just keeps people from sticking a wrench in there and inadvertently letting out all the nitrogen pressure or the damper oil, which would be bad. Okay, we're going to wash this up in the parts cleaner tank just to make sure there's no oil left on the outside, because as you probably learned with me watching me do this, rebuilding shocks is quite messy. So we like to clean them up really good. That way, in case there is a failure at some point, we know that it's not residual oil that are causing no problems, but it's actually something leaking out of the inside of the shock. So I'm going to do that, come back, pop it back on the bike, and we're out. flange bushings. It's a wear item in a shock. These feel really good, so we're gonna put them back in. And this is universally called mounting hardware. This comes in all the different widths to fit the shocks, as well as 2 primary, I think there's 3 or probably 20 more because it's a bike industry, size of bolt that runs through there. But in general, cross country all mountain bike, it's just 2 sizes that you're dealing with. Look at your manufacturer's suggested reinstallation of what gets greased, what gets Loctite, yada yada. Just so you don't go messing anything up. It's really easy sometimes to over torque some of these shock mounting bolts that go on the bike, so you got to be a little careful with this. We're going to put the wheel back in the bike. We're going to pressurize the shock. We're going to compress the shock up and down several times to load the negative air chamber, which you're going to learn about in another video in a couple weeks. Which reminds me, if you hit that like and subscribe button, you'll know when our videos come out. Then when we load the negative by just cycling the shock, it relaxes down to 190. So we lost 12 psi just cycling that shock from about 130 was the first time I had it. And that's all you got to do, folks. Just rebuild it, drop it, order new parts, rebuild it again. Before you know it, you'll be a pro doing this stuff. See ya.